Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your first flip, starting our unit on the Renaissance, right? Now, some of you are like, well, I probably already started a new unit and stuff like that. Speaking of the Renaissance, as I drink out of my Sistine Chapel ceiling mug at my house, my coffee, it's fantastic. Looking at this entire thing, we are now beginning our big in-depth discussion on the Renaissance, right? Which is one of my favorite things to talk about. Y'all have already now gotten your artworks assigned to you. You should be researching those things, looking those things up, and trying to figure out what makes this artwork great, right? To give you a heads up, F period, I know I'm not there right now. It's mainly due to the fact that I'm actually out golfing at the Chappelle Golf Tournament, right? Probably doing a terrible job right now. But don't worry, I'll take some film footage of Mr. Mathern hitting it into water. Now, anyway, looking at the entire thing as well, you have to understand, with that, I have dropped down in the description below a link to a YouTube video that I recorded to my AP kids that actually shows kind of like what a mock presentation is going to look like. So what you're going to end up doing is you're going to do your research on your artwork so you can do a 5 to like whatever how long minute presentation about that artwork specifically. You don't have to make a PowerPoint. I don't need you to make a PowerPoint. All you got to do is come up there when your artwork pops up and just point at stuff and tell me why it's awesome, right? That's why this is a really cool project, because it's very interesting and it's like what's hidden in the artwork. Why is it so cool? What makes it so special? Why are people still talking about it? But the Renaissance is not simply about artwork. It actually has to do with this concept called rebirth. So Renaissance actually in French means rebirth, right? And what is being rebirthed, right? When we're talking about this, like what's being reborn, right? If the Renaissance means rebirth, what are we referring to, Mr. Terry? Well, I'll tell you, all right? So the attributes, intelligence, and ideas of the Greeks and Romans. When we're looking at this entire construct, the Renaissance is kind of supposed to be the formal end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that thinkers during this time period called it that, and like it's kind of a weird categorization of history, and some people would argue that the Renaissance never even happened, but we're not going to get into that debate right now. All you need to understand is that the Renaissance is kind of referred to the time of the reborn or rebirthed aspects of the Greeks and Romans, right? Because remember, the Middle Ages was a really rough time, right? It was a time of like reorganization, consolidation, barbarian invasions, and stuff like that. Listen to me carefully. Stop what you're doing. Do not write all this down. Pick like 3 things from each of these lists to kind of just describe and show how intelligent the Greeks and the Romans were, right? But the thing about it is like the Middle Ages was a rough time period defined by war and disease and tragedy and intense like movements of barbarians and invasions and all this other stuff, right? And also all during a time when most people didn't know how to read or write, when artistic creation was very, very limited, and where literally organized governments were not really a big thing. But remember, that's the Middle Ages from 500 to 1500 AD. But before that, from 476 and before, going all the way to the period before Christ was born, the Greeks and the Romans had been doing like marvelous mental feats, right? Like the Greeks, for example, had philosophy. Remember we talked about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle writing all these constructs down. Well, Socrates didn't, but writing all these ideas down, recording these different events, analyzing questions that could never be answered. You didn't really see that in the Middle Ages until the 1200s when St. Thomas Aquinas is going to pop up, right? And then also, they were historians. The Greeks had many historians that wrote down different ideas. Like Herodotus is the first Greek historian and first historian in Western civilizations ever, right? You've also got theater being born. Remember Greek tragedies and comedies and the birth of fart jokes are like even like longer before Middle Ages. Democracy, architecture, the Olympics, science and mathematics are all being born under the Greeks, right? And then the Romans are going to take all the cool Greek stuff even further. They're going to create an organized military, the republic system of government, roads, because all roads lead to Rome, do they not, right? They're going to make aqueduct systems for bringing fresh water into cities, and also then using those aqueduct systems for plumbing to keep the spread of disease down and stuff like that. Instead, during the Middle Ages, people were just hucking poop out windows and stuff like that, whereas the Romans were above this. They were like, we don't do that. That's gross, okay? They're also going to create 3-branch government, Roman law, and the Julian calendar. The calendar that you use now, the one that's got 365 and 1/4 days, and the leap year once every 4 years, was created by Julius Caesar himself. He literally figured this out and created the modern day calendar. People during the Middle Ages, there's one historian named William Manchester that argues people during the Middle Ages did not know what time it was and didn't even know what day of the week it was, right? So now that's a like loose argument. The church had to know what day of the week it was, of course. So, but the thing about it was, is a person walking around might not. But the Julian calendar was heavily used during this time period, so it's very important to understand. So the Middle Ages is going to come after all those guys, right? After the Romans and Greeks are going to fall out. the Middle Ages will rise up, right? And the Middle Ages, when you're really looking at it, it's like a transitional period, right? It's a transitional period from the fall of Rome to the modern era, right? And the Renaissance is considered the end of this period. What defines the Middle Ages? Limited learning, low economics. It is also going to establish a very wealthy political hierarchy of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church is going to grow very much in power. You're also going to see the rise of nobility, the rise of kings, and also you're going to see a huge gap between rich people and rich people and poor people be created. You either had your vassals, your knights, your lords, and all those people up at the top making tons and tons of money, or you had your serfs all the way down to the bottom, right? The Middle Ages was a really, really rough time period where literally doctors thought the only thing they could do is like bloodlet. Now, granted, all things considered, the Greeks and the Romans weren't really that good at medical science either, but that's neither here nor there. So don't forget, too, that the Middle Ages was not a time of just stupidity. The Easterners were doing fantastic. Africans, Arabs, and Asians had massive advancements in science and mathematics during this time period. And also, the Byzantinians are going to be responsible for holding on until the 1400s and keeping all that Roman and Greek intelligence safe, right? They're going to keep all that stuff safe. They're going to keep it in libraries and in other different like manuscript vaults inside of the Byzantine Empire. So the ideas of the Romans and the Greeks never completely fade away. They're being kept safe over in the Eastern Empire. But Western Rome, places like modern day France and Spain and Portugal and like the now modern day Germany and the Holy Roman Empire are going through periods where they don't get to read philosopher texts from Rome and they don't get to read philosopher texts from Greece. They're actually just sitting there trying to consolidate their governments together, going into war with each other, launching the Crusades, dealing with the Black Death, and then also having that giant 100 Years' War that broke out, right? You have to understand that the Middle Ages saw massive growths in economics from the early to the high, right? Because the early Middle Ages is arguably a dark age, right? It's a period of time where most people couldn't read and write, where Viking raids were a prevalent threat to society, where feudalism is growing. But then from early to high Middle Ages, you saw a growth in economics. You saw a growth in intelligence. You saw some people beginning to read and write at a more frequent rate. You saw the Bayeux Tapestry recording the Battle of Hastings in 1066. You saw the Magna Carta being written up and signed. I know. So you saw all those things happening during the High Middle Ages. Well, then the Late Middle Ages hit, right? Where economies are going to dip, and they're going to take a big, big hit because you're going to have terrible things happen, like the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and another really weird one called the Avignon Papacy. Underneath Avignon Papacy, just write this down, we're not going to over-explain it too much, it's when there were multiple popes running around all of Europe. Literally, there was a big feud between Catholic Church officials, and there ended up being like 2 popes, and then like countries picked the pope they liked the most, which is not the way this is supposed to run. I know Rachel Ann Potter sitting there right now being like, wait, more popes than one? That doesn't make any sense. I know, it's weird. It was a tragedy of the late Middle Ages. It was crazy, right? So the thing about it in the long run, though, is the Avignon Papacy led to all these different popes running around, right? All these different really, really big figures that were arguing over power and trying to like scuffle for power with one another. And then that literally by the end of the Avignon Papacy, also known as the Great Western Schism, literally there were 4 popes all at once, right? Before they finally came to an end in the late Middle Ages. But that right there just even shows that there was tragedy going on in the church, right? That there was a shake in the foundation of the church and that everything was going sideways in the late Middle Ages. So a lot of y'all are probably sitting there thinking to yourself, well, Mr. Terry, the late Middle Ages sounds like it might have like exacerbated things and made everything worse for hundreds and hundreds of years. Weirdly enough, it didn't. So weirdly enough, actually surprisingly enough, the tragedy of the late Middle Ages actually caused economies to leap forward after they were over, right? Once the Black Death ended and the 100 Years' War ended and the Avignon Papacy ended, when all these things came to a close, you would think that the tragedy and the craziness of the late Middle Ages would have made economies terrible for a really long time. But weirdly enough, they began to rise as an exponential rate. They went up very, very quickly. Mostly because you had the rise of guilds and the return of trade, right? So something you need to understand about European historiography is that the feudal system got really shaken up during this entire time period. 50% of Europe is now dead because of the Black Death, and you also have a bunch of crazy stuff going on. Well, this is going to affect society in a really weird way because money didn't die. That didn't go anywhere. But think about it, y'all. If there's less people, and the amount of money is the same, that means more people have more money in their pockets, right? Use it like an example like this, right? Let's say hypothetically we had the 5 represent, or let's say we had 6 people, 2 from each class, right? So we've got, I don't know, we've got Kaylee Dublin and Brianna Fonseca that are in my C period. We've got Ava Bodine and Emma Alvarado that are in my B period. And then we got excuse me, not Ava. We got, no, wait, who have I got? No, we got Avery Scheck-Snyder and Avery Dunn in my F period, right? Those 6 of y'all are all the population of the Middle Ages before the Black Death hit, before the 100 Years' War, before all this stuff. And y'all were basically fighting over the same pot of money, right? The same amount. And so it could only be spread so thin. Well, the 100 Years' War, the Avignon Papacy, and the Black Death kills 50% of y'all. So the only ones left around are Avery Scheck-Snyder, Brianna Fonseca, and then also Ava Bodine, right? And so since y'all are the only ones left, that means that the money didn't die, but that means that there's now money in y'all's pockets. So economies actually rose really, really quickly. And a lot of it has to do with the rise of these things called guilds, right? Now, guilds are a hard thing to understand, but I need you to try your best, okay? Guilds are really, really intense because they're going to be a massive element of the economy of the Middle Ages going forward, and they're going to help people make tons and tons of money during the Middle Ages, okay? What they are they are groups, right? So now think about it this way, okay? They are a group of workers that get together or trade items, and they organize to set a price on their product. Think about it kind of like a labor union, right? So it's like this. A guild would be like if I'm a teacher and I'm doing my own on my own and I'm trying to do my best. And so is Mr. Mathern. And so is Mr. Wooderson. And so is Mr. Madrano, right? A guild would be like if we all came together and we tried to figure out how to do this job to the best of our ability and we set a price on it, right? So that's going to make us more money and it's going to make our product even better, right? So we just started a teaching guild. Now, realistically speaking, in the Middle Ages, there weren't teaching guilds, but there were guilds of like craft makers and stuff like that, and smithing guilds like this one down here where they would actually make different items and like actually smith and make metal together. You had barrel making guilds because barrels were really important because they were huge for trade and you had to move your products throughout them. You had cobblers guilds, which they actually make, oh wait, what are we doing? Stop that. Like they actually had cobblers guilds right here that actually made shoes and other different items as well. You also had carding guilds who like separated wool and made textiles and stuff like that. But really quickly when you're looking at it, you had 2 types of guilds. You had merchant guilds and craft guilds, right? There's a reason why I have a star next to merchant guilds because they're going to be the really important one going forward. They're the ones who spread the Black Death unintentionally, but they're also going to be the ones that make money a little bit faster than everybody, right? Craft guilds are the ones that come together to make a product, right? And merchant guilds are trading the items that craft guilds are making, right? Guilds are going to become a very, very big deal and a very prominent group going forward, and they're going to make tons of money and help surge the economy of the Middle Ages forward. Now, because of this, now that we have more product moving around Europe, we now need people to trade that stuff for us. So return of trade is going to become a very big deal, right? Merchant guilds are going to begin importing things to Europe, right? They're going to start going over to Constantinople, or what would later be Istanbul, picking up products from the Eastern Golden Age, from the Monsoon Marketplace, things like spices and silks and all this different stuff, and bringing it back into Europe, right? They're going to start reinvigorating the European economy. Oh, by the way, this is a picture of Venice, and no, that's not me and my wife. That's just 2 randos I saw online. So the big thing about it, though, in general, they're going to do all these different stuff. Craft guilds are going to begin to specialize and sell their products via the merchants. But where is all this happening? Is it happening all over Europe? Or is it happening in a main place right now, right? Well, it's happening in a main area, right? It's happening in basically in Italy, right? Well, the Italian peninsula, sort of. Like, you have to understand, Italy didn't exist yet. Italy, the country, wasn't a thing. They were all broken up into these different little informal states that actually had their own governments and had their own like economics, and they had their own like different systems of taxation. And so they all ruled themselves independently, right? The big 3, though, that you're going to need to know, this is the chart for this unit. You know how like we had the feudalism diagram you had to fill in on the last test? Then we had the Roman government chart you had to fill in on the last test. You had the Greek time periods you had to fill in on the last test. This is our chart this time. It's going to be a map, right? Because all these places and their locations are going to become very, very important, okay? And so if you want to draw this in your notes, you can. And like, shout out Shay Victory, I know you're going to, right? I know this kid's going to draw it in her notes because she likes drawing things because it helps her remember it. Fonseca, I know you're going to draw this in your notes, right? I know Reese Tedesco, I know you're going to draw this in your notes. There's no question of these things in my mind. But looking at that entire thing, you don't have to draw on Italy if you don't want to. You can totally take a screenshot of it when I'm done if you want to know their location and just make a list. It's really up to you, right? Well, looking at it, though, we've got 3 important cities and I've been to most of them. I only haven't been to one of them. My wife's been to the one, and she really, really loved it, right? So that's not right. All right, so there we go. So the big thing about it, though, is these three important cities include places like Venice. Now, they're going to be a very important one going forward. Venice is the trade and importer and merchant city. For any of y'all that have seen pictures of Venice before, Venice is a city built on the water. It's got canals all over the entire city. They literally have these guys named gondoliers that transport people back and forth. There are water taxis in Venice, but why is this city constructed this way? It's so they could easily move product and trade things throughout the city, because you don't want to necessarily have to move it over a road, because that can be very, very treacherous during the Middle Ages. But Venice in general is the trade and import, come on, zoom in, there we go, trade and importer city. They had exclusive agreements with the Byzantine and the Ottomans to bring goods from the Eastern Golden Age or from the monsoon marketplace into Europe to have them being sold, right? Now, why do I have Byzantine and Ottomans? The Ottomans are the ones who took over the Byzantine. So when the Byzantine fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, they made the same agreement with the Ottomans as well. So Venice is going to make tons and tons of money by bringing these special products like silks and spices and teas and all that different stuff from the Eastern Golden Age into Europe. Well, now that it's moving through Italy, this next one up here at the top is going to become a very important one as well. The city of Milan, right? The Milan is a trade hub, and I have been to this place in Milan. That is Il Duomo in Milan right there, and that is the gallery of Victor Emmanuel II. That's a huge mall that's actually in Milan in the modern era. And Milan, to this day, is considered the wealthiest city in all of Italy, right? Because it's a very important financial sector and stuff like that in northern Italy. But Milan is a trade hub. All the products that came from Venice needed to pass through Milan to get into northern Europe, like places like France and Spain and England and Germany. So what's going to happen when it's passing through Milan is they're going to tax it, and it's going to become a trade hub, and it's going to be a big reason, like Constantinople, that they're going to make a lot of money. If you need a product, you go to Milan, right? Because it's located there, because it's coming from Venice, right? So Milan's going to take tons and tons of money. And if I have time this weekend, I'm going to finally edit that vlog I made for y'all when I was in Milan and in Lake Como, okay? Now, the other big one is Florence, which is absolutely beautiful. Florence, write this down, is known as the cradle of the Renaissance, right? Cradle of the Renaissance, because it fostered it and helped it grow. Florence is very, very well known for making two specific items: textiles, and they created the idea of banks, which is going to be a very, very big deal. All the money that's now moving through Milan and moving through Venice needs somewhere to be kept safe. So the Florentines are going to keep it safe, right? And they literally put it in a safe and created the very first banks that Europe had ever seen, right? And it's going to be ran by one family. And they're super, super wealthy, and my wife and I have been there before. And this is one of those other really awkward pictures, but this one isn't terrible. It's a smirk. I can get away with it. But yeah, this is my wife and I in Florence, and that building behind us was actually paid for by a guild in Florence, right? It's called Il Duomo, or the Duomo in Florence, or the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. The dome on top of it, it's very important. One of you is going to end up being a very important person to understand that, okay? So going forward as well, you also have the Papal States, right? The Papal States is going to be a really big one as well, because they literally are down in the middle, and it basically is Rome and the area that's controlled by the Pope, right? Papal, hence papal supremacy, Papal States, Rome. Rome in the center section of Italy are going to govern and rule the Catholic Church ever since Charlemagne, but they're going to become more of a political entity, less of an economic entity in Renaissance Italy, right? Now, the big ones you need to know for your test are going to be these three and where they're located. The Papal States is just going to help you understand Renaissance Italy a little bit better. But we're going to go ahead and cut it off right here, and we'll talk more about this stuff like banks and how they work and stuff like that in class when I see y'all soon. But y'all have a good one.